Welcome back to Power and Politics. Andrew Scheer says he's staying put as Conservative leader. He said yesterday that he's now leading Canada's largest opposition in history. But do party members still believe he can topple the Liberals in a future election? Time for the Power Panel. In Toronto tonight, Tim Murphy of Macmillan Vantage, and just down the hall from him, Melissa Lantsman of Hill and Knowlton Strategies, alongside former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson, now Chief of Government Relations for University of Toronto. Beside me here in studio, the CBC's Katie Simpson. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Nice to see you. I do definitely want to check in with Melissa, but first, let me just get you, Katie, because you had covered the campaign for many weeks, the Conservatives, and you wrote about this as well. So what are you hearing?
So before the campaign even finished, there were some reports that some Conservative insiders were hoping that Peter MacKay, the former cabinet minister, might want to take a run at the leadership if Andrew Scheer was not as successful as the Conservatives have been hoping, particularly in an election where Justin Trudeau, the Liberal leader, now Prime Minister again, was so wounded throughout that campaign. After there were some additional media reports saying, okay, the knives are out for Mr. Scheer, sources I've been speaking with say, you know, listen, there was overall disappointment with what happened, and there was hope for even further gains, if not, you know, taking out Mr. Trudeau. But what I'm hearing is that people are willing to give Mr. Scheer another chance. They've invested so much in him at this stage in the game, trying to build his brand and get Canadians to get to know him. If they do go in the direction of someone else, if there is another leadership contest and it isn't someone with a big platform, the party is again going to have to reinvest in that person and get them known to Canadians. That's one issue there. The other issue I'm hearing about, sources telling me off the record, is that the way that the sort of agitators are being seen right now, the people who are sharpening those knives, they're being seen as people from outside of caucus who are trying to lob grenades into caucus and try and shake things up. I was told by sources in caucus that they feel that Mr. Scheer will be able to get the support of caucus. However, one senior Conservative said to me, look, you know, when this happened to Stephen Harper in 2004, he had to sit caucus down and say, okay, listen, here's where we went wrong. Here's what I've learned. Here's what I'm going to do differently next time. I need you to have my back. I'm going to have your back, and sort of rally the troops to get everyone together and move forward in a united way. I'm being told that that's the message that Mr. Scheer is going to need to send to caucus to ensure he shores up that support. But there are a couple of things. One, there is an issue in Quebec. Everyone I spoke to suggested to me that there is a significant challenge with how the campaign played out in Quebec, not resonating with Quebec voters. The other issue that came up was Mr. Scheer's position on social issues, whether it be same-sex marriage or abortion, and how that came up constantly at the doors, particularly in Ontario and particularly in Quebec. So there are going to need to be a path forward. If Mr. Scheer is going to have a path to victory, that requires Quebec and Ontario, and how they're going to deal that and address with that, that's going to be up to Mr. Scheer and his inner circle.
Melissa, what do you think of especially the latter part of that analysis, the idea that particularly in Quebec and on social issues, that's where the room for improvement exists?
Well, I think in terms of the room for improvement, there needs to be an actual post-mortem of the campaign done. So that's everything from stance on issues, policy, organization. And I think the campaign team is responsible for providing sort of a document, a path forward, what we did wrong, rather than I think that what many people are hearing of, we were really close and we're going to win again. So there's a happy medium between what did we do wrong and sort of we're the government in waiting. And then there's also the other path of what Mr. Scheer has to do, come when the House comes back, and it's to look like a prime minister, to keep the caucus together, to keep the caucus on side, and that's going to be frankly very difficult. He does have, there's a couple things here that he needs to look at. One, if this government is a government that's going to be around for 2 years, and I think we'll see that sort of in the early days on how the government functions. If it's there for 2 years, I think Mr. Scheer has a better chance of staying, because again, it's tough to introduce somebody new to the Canadian public. If it's 4 years, I think he's in a bit more trouble.
What do you think, Andrew?
Well, I think one of the big problems for the Conservatives is Andrew Scheer. And I think we should just be upfront about that it was not a problem for people in Ontario and Quebec to vote for right-wing governments. They have them provincially now. What they don't want are social conservatives. And I just don't see how Andrew Scheer shakes that. I don't care how many pride parades he's in between now and the next election. People aren't going to believe that his values line up. And that's, I think, really what happened here in Ontario and probably to a certain extent in Quebec, is that people just close the door on it. They just don't trust that social conservative set of values isn't going to creep in to the policy direction of the Conservative Party. It's what kept the Reform out. It's what kept the Alliance out. It's now keeping the mainstream Conservative Party out. And until they really figure out how to address that, I think that their opportunities for seat gains really do end at that Manitoba-Ontario border.
Do you think that's true, Tim? I mean, is there a path in which, or a way in which Mr. Scheer could address those kinds of concerns, particularly as they resonate, as Katie mentioned, in Ontario and Quebec, if that's the case?
Well, I think it is a problem for him, and I do think the things that are important to him as a human being, he clearly, I think by his own admission and his own set of beliefs, put him in a position on the social conservative end of the spectrum, which is entirely his right and prerogative. The problem is it does put him offside a lot of voters who care about those issues in Ontario and particularly Quebec. And it's tough to see where he gets growth if that continues to be a dominant theme. And I also, look, Conservatives aren't going to take advice from either New Democrats or Liberals. But at the end of the day, first off, when you look at it, I think one of the problems he's got some very prominent, high-profile Conservatives who, yes, aren't in caucus, but who've got a base in the party. And that's always a challenge for any leader. I think his strategic position is different, for example, than Stephen Harper in 2004, who had, you saw a new leader in Paul Martin, who I work for, be reduced to a minority, continued to have the sponsorship scandal that was from the prior government, continued to be a pressure on the government. So the kind of potential for growth, I think, was seen to be there, and a leader, frankly, who had the discipline and the ability to expand the people to whom he was speaking as a politician. It's not clear to me Andrew Scheer has either of those strategic positioning or that personal growth ability in him.
Katie, when we talk about Ontario in particular, a lot of discussion throughout the campaign, prior to the campaign, and of course I want Melissa and Andrew and everyone to weigh in on this as well, but around the quote-unquote Ford factor. Mm-hmm. And on election night, I found interesting, and not a comment we heard during the campaign at all, one from Bob Ray and then backed up by Corey Teneycke, who of course managed and manages Doug Ford's campaign, saying that it was actually a mistake for Andrew Scheer to distance himself as much as he did from Ford. Are you hearing anything about any reflections being done on that?
Not necessarily, but what I'm hearing is that Mr. Ford himself, the Premier of Ontario, of course, he was more disciplined than he's ever been at any point in his public life in trying not to engage in taking on, whether it be Justin Trudeau, whether it be frustration with Andrew Scheer, not inviting him out for any sort of campaign events, as well as, what stands out to me on this issue is that when Andrew Scheer was in the Greater Toronto area and he made his pledge around subways, that is Doug Ford's lunch. That is subways. That's what got his brother elected at Toronto City Hall. That's in part what helped get him, some security at Queen's Park. And but as Bob Ray pointed out, Doug Ford won that election with an overwhelming mandate, and he was democratically elected by the voters of Ontario. Yes, there have been some significant challenges, and that might be putting it mildly, particularly in dealing with cuts to autism funding and, concerns around other cuts in programs in Ontario. The Conservatives clearly looked at the big picture, looked at Doug Ford's popularity, made that decision. I'm sure that the full post-mortem, because they're going to take a look at everything that took place and try and identify, okay, where did things go wrong? What can we do better next time? So I'm sure that would be in there, but I'm not hearing anything at this stage. Yeah,
I think Doug Ford is actually one of the surprise winners out of this campaign for two reasons. One, his fingerprints are nowhere on what the end result was in Ottawa. Jason Kenney's are all over it. It ended up that every single seat Jason Kenney campaigned in, the Conservatives lost. There's no doubt the Ford Nation folks will be making that point within the Conservative Party. But the second thing it did, and this is very inside Ontario politics, by taking Doug Ford off of the TV screens for 8 weeks, or whatever it ended up being, they allowed him to actually advance his agenda of the reset. And I think what you're going to see is as he comes back now into full focus as the legislature here reconvenes next week, this puts him in a much stronger position to talk about issues in a very different way, a very different type of Doug Ford. And you're already seeing it today as he's making comments about the McKenna situation up in Ottawa and a more conciliatory approach. Yeah. His comments to the Prime Minister about, look, we just need to leave the politics behind and get on with helping people. This is much more the kind of Doug Ford we used to hear at City Hall. Just like, let's do it for the folks, for the people. and I think he's getting his mojo back.
Even on, and Melissa, I want to bring you in a second, even on education, we'll have more on the announcement, but today they're rolling back, essentially, they're making an offer to roll back the class size limits that they had changed. So another acknowledgement, but another, as you say, like another part of that whole reset. Melissa, what do you think, especially about what Corey and Bob Ray were saying about it being a mistake? Do you think it was?
So, you know, Doug Ford won 76 seats in Ontario. He won a clear majority on the promise of making life more affordable from Ontario. I know that sounds familiar, but it certainly wasn't the ballot question in this election. Our attribution to why the Conservatives went, it went poorly for the Conservatives here is sometimes it's about social issues and sometimes it's about Doug Ford. We don't actually know sort of the entire story of the campaign. Part of it was expectations management, but it certainly wasn't, it wasn't a Doug Ford issue. He's going to come out of this looking much better. He's already come out of this looking much better to work with the feds, to get the money for transit, to get the money for infrastructure, to get the money for mental health. This is a huge win for the Ford government. And what Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives did, you can't make this both a referendum on the Prime Minister and a question of affordability. You got to sort of pick a lane, and none of those worked out for Andrew Scheer, at least in Ontario. So certainly not a Doug Ford problem.
Quick last word to you, Tim, before I take a quick commercial break.
Yeah, there is a reason both the federal Conservatives and the federal Liberals actually pursued the two halves of the same coin in the strategy, right? I mean, Justin Trudeau spent a lot of time saying, Doug Ford, Doug Ford, Doug Ford, come out to play. And the Conservatives spent a lot of time saying, no, he can't come out to play. And they both had very strong reasons for that. So for me, the kind of notion that, golly, if Doug Ford had been allowed loose in the campaign, things would have been different for the Conservatives federally, it seems to me to be just wrong-headed. There's a reason both the federal parties pursued the same strategy from different points of view. That being said, I agree with the analysis that certainly within the Conservative movement, Premier Ford's come out better, and I think actually it has given him some time out of the limelight to create an opportunity to reset.
I know that I've got really big shoes to fill. Lisa's a good MP, and we've had a couple of really good conversations over the last couple of months. I have the utmost respect for Ms. Wright and her work. I hope that we can sit down for lunch and talk about Milton and talk about what we, a little bit of planning. It's important to when I was on boards, it was always a good idea to make sure that there was a plan in place when there was a transition, and I hope that's possible.
Monday's election resulted in some high-profile losses for all parties. Perhaps the biggest one for the Conservatives was Lisa Wright. She was the party's deputy leader. In Stephen Harper's cabinet, she served at different times as Minister of Natural Resources, Labour and Transport. Wright has represented the Milton, Ontario riding since 2008. She lost her seat Monday night to one of the Liberals' celebrity candidates, Anna Van Koeverden, a four-time Olympic medal winner. It was his first time running. Joining us now from Toronto is Lisa Wright. Hi, Miss Wright. Nice to see you.
Good to be here, Vashi.
Thanks for doing this. I was telling you in the break that I watched on election night as you were so generous with your time and being interviewed, I think, by one of my colleagues. And you said at the time that it was so fresh, and I took your point that you weren't, you hadn't contemplated exactly what happened yet. Yeah. Since it's been 2 whole days since then, have you put much thought to it at all? And if you have, what conclusions have you arrived at?
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm blown away by the many, many people who have written to me, either through Twitter, Facebook, or even through my parliamentary account, to thank me for my service and say really nice things. So losing isn't such a bad thing when you're reminded that you made a difference in people's lives and that they appreciate what you brought to the table for the last 11 years. So that makes it a lot easier, I have to say. And since then, I have been doing the mundane things like closing up the office and trying to figure out what the next steps are going to be beyond helping my son's basketball team on Sunday.
Do you think the outcome of your race was particular to conditions in the riding, or a larger expression of something to do with the party as a whole?
Oh, I think that me winning in 2015, when that red wave came through, and basically I think about it emanates out from the 416. And I think I was very fortunate to make it in 2015. I knew this was going to be a tough race, regardless of who the candidate was going to be, because you could sense that there were changes coming in the riding in terms of people who were not naturally conservative that were coming in from downtown Toronto and Mississauga, because housing prices are far more reasonable in Milton. So I could feel it coming, and certainly that's exactly what happened on Monday night.
Do you, and I take your point, again, it's only been 2 days, do you think this forward factor had anything to do with it? You know, it was speculated on, I'm sure, as you heard, months before the campaign and during the campaign. We had Bob Ray on the show on Monday with Corey tonight, and they were saying, actually, it's the reverse. It was a mistake not to associate more with Doug Ford during the campaign. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it really is riding by riding, and I found as much support for the Premier and his team and Parm Gill at the doors as I did people who expressed concern specifically about what was happening during the labor issues around the CUPE possible strike. Now, once that strike was sorted out, people were far more calm about it, and quite frankly, it didn't come up as much. But the Liberals ran on it, Vashi. I mean, it was in all of the information that was put out to people, was mentioned in every one of my debates, and it certainly flooded all the airwaves for people who are in their cars commuting back and forth to Milton. So there was an attempt by the Liberals to do it. Far as I'm concerned, the Premier still enjoyed popularity within the riding.
Do you think it was a mistake then for Andrew Scheer not to have associated more with him during the campaign?
I think nobody can make that call, to be honest, but I do think what is important is that we do ask those questions of ourselves and that we talk to the candidates in the 416 and the 905, hear what they experienced on the ground. My riding may be very different than other people's ridings, but the reality is that we didn't win. So we've got to figure out how to win and determine what policies are going to make sense and what positions are going to make sense.
You bring up an interesting point because we had a former DCOM, Director of Communications for Stephen Harper, on the show yesterday. He said in 2004, when they were able to reduce the government to a minority, but they didn't win a majority, they had this moment where they really, under the direction of former Prime Minister Harper, took a surgical look at everything that might have gone wrong and went deep, even so far as looking at the leader himself. And he said that was actually like the most crucial thing they did to move forward. Based on what you've heard so far from the leadership of your party, do you have confidence that that will happen?
Yeah, I do, very much so. And, I've already spoken to Andrew this week, and I know that he definitely wants to make sure that we go back and assess what happened. And he's more than willing to go in and talk to everybody that needs to be spoken to in order to find out for himself exactly what was happening. And I think it's fair to say that we were surprised that it was such a loss for the 416-905 area specifically on Monday night. I think we were a little bit taken by surprise. We had thought that we were in better shape in a number of the ridings, and as a result, we do need to go back, because I think a lot of candidates too felt that they were doing good, which means to me, Vashi, and it happened in my riding, everybody's telling you yes, yes, yes at the doors, and then they go and they vote a different way. So that is something new. I have no idea. That is one of the questions I really do have out of the whole prospect, because my data was solid and we got our vote out, and yet you can see from the results, Adam got over 50% of the vote.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, it's interesting that he's told you that kind of review will take place, because publicly so far, and there's only been one press conference obviously, but the speech after the election, the way in which Mr. Scheer is framing it is, and he's laying out facts, yes, you did win a higher percentage of the popular vote than the Liberals, and you have a huge seat count as an opposition parties, you picked up seats as well across the country, but he's framing it as that, which I would say leaves the impression that there isn't a whole lot of soul searching going on. Obviously, you have a very different impression, but is it a mistake, I guess, to frame it as, we're just the government in waiting and people chose to forgive Justin Trudeau, or is there something different that should be said?
Well, I think what both things are being said, quite frankly. First of all, those are the facts. We have more seats than we had before. We got more popular vote. We're returning to Ottawa they are returning to Ottawa extremely strong, sorry. So
old habits die hard, yeah.
I know. They are returning to Ottawa very strong, and they are going to hold that government to account. At the same time, we do have to do a deeper dive in areas that we didn't perform where we thought we were going to perform better. And I don't think that's any giant announcement that has been made or not been made. That's just kind of what a normal party would do and what a normal leader would do, and I fully anticipate that's what's going to happen.
I read your interview in the Globe today, and you said that Mr. Scheer deserves another shot at the next election. Why do you believe that?
I believe that because it's only been 2 years since the leadership. There's a reason why we all rallied behind and chose Andrew and supported him and developed a brand around him, and we went out and campaigned for him. And what we need to do now is just to execute better on what we believe the urban issues are going to be and what they are, and communicate those to to our constituents and make sure they understand that a Conservative plan is something that can absolutely work for them to make their lives better.
Can I ask you a question about his own positioning on certain issues? Because you know this was discussed at least a lot in the media. There is some observation since the conclusion of this election that the positions that he took, and I know that you defended it throughout the campaign, but the idea that he wasn't particularly clear, at least at the start of the campaign, on where his personal beliefs lay when it came to abortion and same-sex marriage, or that he didn't want to march in a pride parade. Like, do you think in your gut that any of that impacted the perception of your party, particularly in the 416 and out, as you mentioned, into the 905?
Well, my firm belief is this, that if it wasn't Andrew's personal beliefs that were going to be spoken about by the opposition, by the Liberals in the campaign and the NDP and the media, it would have been somebody else in my caucus. You would have found somebody else who had said something in the past because of their beliefs, and you would have put that on a national stage and asked for the leader to account for that. I think that it was a purpose to have abortion and these kinds of social issues as a wedge issue on the Conservatives, and that would have happened regardless of who the leader was. And that's the unfortunate state of this entire election, because it wasn't about issues. It was about finding wedge issues to try to scare people. And that's a disappointment I have.
So strategically then, taking aside the sort of values argument or the debate or the merits of it or whatever, but strategically, does, for example, Mr. Scheer not marching in a pride parade then help the cause of what you just described?
Vashi, I mean, we ran against a guy who I can't even describe the amounts of issues that the Prime Minister himself had during the campaign and the things that he had
fair
to
point, and
answer for, right?
he had got lots of questions too.
The reality is, so are you going to ask him whether or not he's ever going to appear in blackface again? It's
if he would do an interview, I would. 100%.
Oh well, there you go,
Yeah.
there you go. So I guess my answer to that is this: I believe fundamentally that those issues were going to be something that would be talked about in this campaign, because that's the way that the governing party wanted to run this campaign, a campaign based upon wedging people on their personal beliefs. They're not going to be able to do that again because they got a minority. It didn't work that well. It may have worked. It didn't work that well. And now they got to sit down and they got to govern and they got to do what's right for Canada, and we're going to hold them to account.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
They're going to hold them to account.
They're going to. Thanks a lot for making time for us today and so many other times as well. Hope to have you back on the show sometime soon. Thanks, Ms.
You
Ray.
bet, Vashi. Bye.
Appreciate it. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.